In Tuesday's Financial Times, I'm writing about the relative merits of economics and history and standing up for historians. It seems to me that economists have been a little bit overconfident over the last 20 years and that they're still a bit too inclined to regard their discipline as something close to a science, something like physics, whereas it seems to me that actually it's a bit more like history, something which attempts to make sense of society, but that shouldn't be taken too seriously as something with predicative power and with all the fancy models that economists like to come up with. Now, I say that with a degree of hesitancy because I have next to me a very distinguished economist, my colleague Martin Wolf. Martin, what do you think of that argument?
Well, I certainly agree with you that economics has been seriously oversold, and I think it's clear that we can't forecast very well. In fact, some of the best sort of analytical models suggest we can't forecast anything because all the news is already in the market, in the economy, so of course we can't forecast anything. But in fact, it's not as impressive as that. It's clear that we can't forecast anything. But that seems to me to go much too far to say that having some sort of rigorous framework of analysis for how the economy as a whole, and even more bits of it, work, isn't to say that that isn't valuable seems to me to be just wrong. You end up with just suggesting there are lots of completely discrete stories and no general rules at all. Are you really going to say that?
No, well, obviously, I suppose if you're a policymaker, that's paralysing. You can't say that. But on the other hand, I've been struck by the way that economists, even those who've been inclined to say, yes, something went badly wrong, the way they've reacted. There was an article I was read by Joseph Stiglitz where he said, you know, we economists, we must re-examine our profession, and yet he ends up saying essentially that we just need to come up with a new paradigm which will give us, and he actually talks of economics as a kind of science. And I just wonder whether that whole idea of economics is something which is a slightly softer version of physics, if you like, with a lot of mathematical paraphernalia and models and so on, is actually more misconceived than someone like Stiglitz would realise.
Let me suggest that the analogy is wrong. The way I think about economics, at least as the way we think about the economy as a whole, is that evolutionary biology is a more useful paradigm for thinking about what economics is. I don't want to say it's a successful. With evolutionary biology, we cannot predict the future. We don't know how species are going to evolve. We understand the processes a bit, and we have some very specific models for particular sorts of interactions, which are clearly not the whole thing. Well, it seems to me economics is a bit like that. You cannot predict how the economy is going to evolve. We do understand some of the processes and mechanisms, our competition in particular as a driving force, technological innovation and so forth. So let's forget the physics thing. I tend to agree with that. But on your own model, evolution isn't predictive, so it's not a science. But actually, it's pretty clearly it is a scientific approach. And in the same way, I would say economics has aspects of science, but it's not physics.
And is maybe the distinction that economics, like evolutionary biology, is not something you can isolate in a laboratory and say, okay, these are the sort of 5 variables that we're going to isolate. It's the same with evolutionary biology. You have the whole of society to deal with, so it's harder to kind of work out what all the relevant variables are.
Yes, and I would go further to say, look, take a very big issue. When China started reforming itself and going to the market, nobody knew quite what would follow, but when the Chinese started reforming, they knew sort of what to do, what would be involved in moving to markets, in using markets, in creating public goods. Now, that machinery of thinking, the Chinese got from Western economics, so they won't admit it. They didn't have it 200 years ago. So it does seem to me that over the last couple of centuries, we've at least got some ideas of how economies work. And if you look at the incredible development success going on in the world at the moment, I would say that's a bigger proof of the success of economics than our obvious failure to predict the cycle shows that we haven't got a clue.
But aren't they just learning in the way that historians would learn, by empiricism, by trial and error, that rather than having this kind of paraphernalia of maths and models and so on, they're just saying, oh, well, you know, Marxism obviously didn't work, let's try something else. Isn't it just that simple?
Yeah, the maths and models, I think, are excessive. They're just a way of making specific arguments more concrete. But the underlying ways of thinking require a little bit more than just learning from experience, because you're constantly facing slightly new experiences. We don't always do very well with them. But even if you take the financial crisis, I mean, one of the things we have to start asking ourselves is, well, why did the incentives go so wrong? Well, to answer that question, you actually have to analyze, well, how do incentives work in the financial sector? Well, that is a theoretical question. Then you have to look at it and how it interacts with the way people think. But you have to have some sort of framework of analysis. Without a framework of analysis, you really got no more than the story, well, the financial system collapsed. What are we to do? No idea. Not do that again, whatever it is. Surely we have to have some framework of analysis of this kind.
And yet, to me, as an outsider, economics does seem in a bit of a mess, because even now, economists are at war over what went wrong and how to respond. It's a bit like, if it's a science, it's a bit like having medical scientists, one of whom wants to saw off your left leg and the other one wants to inject you with something. And how much progress has economics really made?
Well, that's a very profound question. I think what is important, and here I agree, is how far, as it were, the fundamental starting point of the subject, which was in terms of more or less rational individuals pursuing their own self-interest, maximizing, as it were, their welfare in the context of competitive markets, how much that is a useful way of thinking about the world. I take the view that it's still a useful way of thinking about the world, but we have to be quite careful in pursuing it to its complete logical conclusion. And the difficulty, and here I am with you, is human beings are more complicated than the other processes we think about, and it isn't easy to reduce them to such simple forms of behavior. And for that reason, yes, economics is really, really difficult. It's a very complicated system. But I wouldn't agree that we've learnt nothing. We've just not learnt as much as we thought we had.